I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and emeritus professor of Middle Eastern History, Political Science, and Israel Studies here in Atlanta. I'll be the moderator of Inside Palestinian Politics, Fatah, Hamas, and Conflicts in the National Movement. Our 14th webinar in our Center for Israel Education's ongoing series titled Israel's 9/11, focusing on the Hamas attack that led to Israel's response in what has become the Hamas-Israel war. Previous ones are archived on our website, and there's also an audio vision for each. We established the Center for Israel Education in 2008 to respond to inquiries for reliable sources and data about all aspects of Zionism in Israel. Curiosity for content has enabled us to build a trustworthy place where rigorous standards are maintained daily. Last year, for example, we had 1.8 million users who visited our website, israeled.org. And if you benefit from the webinars and the website, support our work on the donate page. These webinars allow CIE to provide the best analysts, academics, and diplomats to analyze the causes, consequences, and responses to the attacks by Hamas terrorists on October 7th. Today, we have Yohanan Tzoreff, Ghaith al-Omari, and Harel Chorev as our welcome guests. With sudden effectiveness, Hamas launched its vicious attack on October 7th. It did so for multiple reasons: to kill Jews and non-Jews who were in Israel, to degrade Israel's morale, to demoralize its people, to drain its resolve, and force supporters of Israel worldwide to doubt their support for Israel, to open pathways for the international community to condemn Israel for what Hamas leaders knew would be Israel's swift and massive retaliation, to take hostage and use them as future collateral to preserve Hamas's continuity as a viable movement, to slow down or stop other Arab states from accepting or recognizing Israel. Saudi Arabia, for example. Hamas also sought to promote its ideology that Israel is illegitimate, that Jews do not constitute a nation, to show to other states and insurgencies in the Middle East that Hamas does not talk, but it takes action. He tried and is trying very hard to gain direction over the Palestinian Arab National Movement in its ongoing competition with other elements within the movement, including those who reside in Ramallah. It has tried to show its funders that Islamic ideology has value and can pay off, that Israel might be a U.S. puppet, and maybe, if possible, drive a wedge in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. These are just some of its motivations. There may be others, including perhaps competition amongst the cadre within Hamas for who leads the Hamas movement tomorrow. Let me start off with Ghaith and ask him what he thinks everyone should know or understand about the Palestinian Arab movement today and its component parts and its ideologies.
I'm going to start really with some very broad headlines, and I'm sure we're going to go into more details. But I would look at Palestinian politics today from two different angles. One is what's happening at the top, and one is what's happening in terms of the public. So let me start with the top. At the top today, there are only two actors in Palestinian politics. There's Hamas and there's Fatah, and never that one shall meet. There is existential competition between them about who leads the Palestinian national movement. And each one of them has a number of assets and a number of vulnerabilities. So let me start with Fatah, which is the leader of the PLO today and the leader of the Palestinian Authority. Fatah is the establishment party. It is the party that is recognized officially as the leader of the Palestinian people. It's the party that has the institutional ownership of Palestinian key and national institutions. It's the party that has international relations, regional relations, etc. Yet it is a party that has been going through some major legitimacy deficit, as it were. Fatah is a party that basically threw its lot with the idea that you can have Palestinian liberation through diplomacy, an idea that has basically so far failed to deliver. It's a party that has been presiding over a very corrupt and very inefficient and very irresponsive Palestinian authority. So it doesn't have that kind of governance legitimacy. And it's a party, particularly under the current leader, Mahmoud Abbas, that is shifting from what it was in the past, a vibrant, inclusive, almost umbrella organization, to something resembling the Ba'ath Party, or something resembling the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Under Abbas, the vibrancy disappeared, and it is now seen as loyalty matters more than anything else. So it's a party with the official credentials, but very weak in terms of public support. Now you go to Hamas. Hamas is much more vibrant. It's one that presents itself as we act, we don't talk, tries to present a more lively image, etc. And frankly, as you said, part of why they launched October 7th is to burnish their domestic credentials. Yet it's a party that also has vulnerabilities. It's a deeply ideological party. And yes, Palestinians are a conservative society, but political Islam does not necessarily have as much sway there. It's a party that is regionally isolated, with the exception of Qatar and Turkey. No one wants to deal with them. But the two parties basically are competing, and this is what defines Palestinian politics. If you go to the public level, the public trusts none of the above. If you look at polling, there's some good polling out there, you will see that there is a core constituency for each party, but the majority basically trust none of the above. So today, what we see is among young Palestinians, talent, skill, etc., is moving away from politics. And we have a huge vacuum. And this vacuum is something that is creating a degree of, I believe, political and ultimately security instability. So that's it in kind of very broad outlines.
Great, presented it very well. I would even emphasize with what he finished, and that's, of course, the growth as a result of what he described, the growth of this block of unidentified or unaffiliated Palestinians, more than 50%, particularly in the West Bank, that do not choose or would not choose before October 7th, either Hamas or Fatah. I must say, as a disclaimer, that since October 7th, which is a deal breaker and a groundbreaking, of course, development, that I'm really anxious to know what is the situation today, because October 7th definitely is such a milestone that I would really like to know what's the effect on especially the young generation that were totally desperate of their politics, because of the reason Ray explained. The informal networks of Hamas, the way Hamas is established in the society, I think it's a fascinating issue and not many address it, although that would be the key for many things, including the so-called day after. What I mean by that is the way that Hamas is integrated into the society through networks of family, of neighboring ties, of even other kinds of ties. I would even say pre-1948 ties. When you examine, for example, the way the elite of Hamas is built, you see that the trust is, of course, the main source there. The most important thing that these people were after in building their networks. So even in the days of Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, the founder of Hamas, you can see that the people around him were people from the same village that he belonged to before 1948, the village of Jura. Just for example, Salah al-Baghdawil, Ahmed Bachar, that was killed in the current operation, Said Siam, who was killed by Israel already in Fatah-led, and of course, the well-known Ismail Haniyeh, who is the head of the political bureau of Hamas. At the same time, while you're having the formal positions, the formal ties, under the surface, you have those familial ties, ties that really belong to the pre-1948 era. And we can find it both in the leadership of Hamas, but also in any other kind of operation. Take, for example, the organization behind the abducting and killing of the 3 yeshiva students back in 2014. This whole thing was orchestrated by the same family network of Kawasme from Hebron, 11 or 12 people altogether, and was coordinated between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank on the basis of these familial ties. Namely, a brother by the name of Mahmoud Kawasme was released in the Gilad Shalit deal, was transferring all the funds for this attack to his own brother, Hussam, and so on and so forth. And you have 11 or 12 people like that. So it's all about trust, all about who we can depend on. And you have many other, of course, examples. Moreover, social mobilization, I would call it, or political mobilization within the movement itself, also based on such ties. For example, Ahmed Jabari, the commander of the Ezzadin al-Qassam, killed by Israel in 2012, actually promoted himself through the marriage ties that he had with both Abdelaziz Rantisi, back then the leader of Hamas, which he married his daughter, and Salah Shkhade, that became also married-in-law. So these things are extremely important, including, as I said, for the day after, because given the, let's say, the assumption that Israel will succeed with dismantling Hamas, the first thing Hamas will do is to go back to these ties, to go back to these networks that really will allow it to repenetrate, I would say, to the society and to renovate or reconstruct these networks as the first stage of trying to come back to the forefront of the stage.
I want to talk about the main players and then to go to the society. I think I agree with what Ray said and also most of what Harel said, but what I want to emphasize is that there are really two main players in the Palestinian politics. There is Fatah and Hamas. But at the same time, we have to say that there is a big gap between both leadership of those two groups and the people. I think that the situation that we find in the Palestinian arena since 10 years ago, maybe more than 10 years ago, people don't believe that Fatah and, let's say, the national stream can really bring peace or can really succeed in their way. But at the same time, they do not feel that Hamas can bring something better than the national stream. So during all this period, I think that the people look for something new. They wanted to see new leadership, a unification of the power between Hamas and Fatah, in order to reach to a new position that can bring the people to something new. And I think what we see today, the big support with Hamas in these days is a result of frustration, what happened during all these years. Hamas tried since 2017 to reach reconciliation with Fatah. And it didn't succeed because Abu Mazen does not want to reach reconciliation. He doesn't want to sit with the Muslim Brotherhood until they will dismantle their military power and commit to his policy. So they can't accept it. And they tried to reach with him till 2021 to reconciliation. They didn't succeed. The main issue was the election that was cancelled in May 2021. And since this point, we find Hamas trying to do something new till we reach to this situation that I think Hamas succeeded, decided even to suicide. Yes, they took in their account that Israel is not going to react as it reacted before. And I think they take it in their account, even that they are going to reach to their end at the end of this war. So I think we have to look to the situation in the Palestinian area from this point of view. About the society in West Bank, I want you to pay attention to the situation that we find today, even 3 months after the beginning of this war. We don't find the people in the West Bank going out to the streets. There is no big demonstrations against Israel or against the Palestinian Authority. I think the situation in the West Bank is different than it is in Gaza. There is something that was created during the days of Salam Fayyad when he was the prime minister. There is a middle class. People used to get their income every month, and they don't want to lose what they have already achieved. So I think that the stability that we find in these days in the West Bank is maybe the main difference today between the people in this area and the people in Gaza. They want to keep what they have, but they're all in the refugee camps. There is still a lot of confrontation with Israeli people by the terror groups. I think that the Palestinian Authority also play a good role, even its weakness in these days. I think that their security system do something in order to prevent the people to go to the street and to make demonstration. They think that it will affect them negatively and they don't want them to do it.
Let me try and tie some threads here. So it seems that there's a disunity or a measure of dysfunctionality, certainly with the PA and the PLO in the West Bank. And there's a measure of commitment on the part of Hamas that they have to bring the house down on themselves. They will, but they also know that they're the activists. The dysfunctional nature of both places makes it very difficult for them to unite with one another, in part because their leaderships don't want to accept one another. How can one possibly begin to think about the PA or the PA in conjunction with something else as being part of the morning after?
The 2007 milestone have this great importance here.
You mean when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip from the PA?
Definitely by creating the distrust that you see, the mistrust, and you cannot really understand their relations and they're reluctant to reach to a reconciliation without understanding what kind of, I would say, a shock for the Fatah, pretty much like the Israelis after October 7th, is still experiencing when they think about Hamas. You need to speak to Palestinians who experienced it to see how much sometimes hate actually Hamas because of this. This is a major milestone in the development of their relations.
I was a PA official at that point, and he is absolutely right. The sense of not competition, but existential enmity, I think, at least in that generation, very much exists. And this is true of Fatah in the West Bank and Gaza. The sense is there is no coexistence with those guys. They are out to get us. And I'm sure Hamas feels the same on the Fatah side. Where I would disagree with you slightly, Ken, is I don't think it is only a dysfunction at the leadership level that's preventing unity. We have to acknowledge that what Hamas stands for and what the Fatah stands for is irreconcilable. At its very nature, the image of what a Palestine in the future will be, two-state solution versus one, theocracy versus secular, all of these are some of the reasons why we don't have unity. Certainly, there's what's on top, but also there is more structural issues. And I think there is no way of getting these two movements together. The problem is, as you rightly said, how does this play out in operational terms today? I'm very reluctant to look in the future because something as big as October 7th will inevitably produce some major changes in both the domestic politics of Israel and the Palestinians. Among the Palestinians, it's clear to me that Hamas, while it might emerge more popular, even though the past has shown us that Hamas is popular during the war, but not so much after the war, yet it will be decimated in organizational terms. And it's very clear that the PA cannot survive and Fatah cannot survive in its current iteration. It has been completely useless. What will come out of that? It's very hard to tell because there are too many moving pieces. And while I agree with Yohanan in terms of the PA has been playing a very positive role in keeping things quiet in the West Bank, yet we cannot deny that its ability to govern the West Bank has also been eroded. Not in October 7th, even before that. You remember that before October 7th, PA had no real control in Jenin, Nablus. In Hebron, for example, it's really the informal network that Harel was speaking about that were keeping that area quiet. So unless you end up with a major shake of the whole system, it's very hard to see how it's going to continue functioning. The only thing I can tell you is I cannot see it functioning the way it was pre-October 7th.
Just because there's an absence of demonstration in public by people in the West Bank, and they haven't come to the streets to favor Hamas publicly, it doesn't mean that they don't privately believe that Hamas deserves credit for action, and it also doesn't mean that they're willingly going to continue to accept Israel's presence in the West Bank because they're just sitting there without demonstrating. You have to be careful about making assumptions that you don't really know about.
I really believe the public polls that say that most of the people in the West Bank support what Hamas did. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that they are going to support Hamas in the future. There is a lot of criticism against Hamas, and we will find it, I think, after the war, because people will begin to ask themselves what happened here, why Hamas did all this destruction in Gaza Strip, and how Hamas promote our national project. This question will be asked after this war. But now, today, Palestinians feel good when Israel suffers. There is a hero that makes something against Israel and try to dismantle the moral inside Israel, and at the same time try to reshape the Palestinian politics. I think that this is one of his main targets, and I don't know if it will succeed at the end of the day. I think that we are not going to find the people in the West Bank in the street in the near future. I think that still they are thinking in other way. I'm happy that Raith agree with me about the role that the Palestinian Authority plays in this situation. I think that in Israel there is a lot of criticism against the Palestinian Authority. Many of our politics don't like to give any kind of compliments to the Palestinian Authority, but in our security system, they really understand the situation as it is. Now, I want to say something what you asked at the beginning of your question. I think it's true that there's a big difference to find unification between both sides. It's the same issue in other Arab countries. Look what happened in Egypt after the election in 2012. Morsi could stay only for 1 year, and he was crushed away by the people, not only by the army. Most leaders of the Arab world don't like the Muslim Brotherhood as part of the politics, as part of the leadership. Also, I think Abu Mazen belonged to this group of leaders. He don't want the Muslim Brotherhood to be part of his decisions maker. So maybe we have to wait for the day after Abu Mazen. Maybe the new leaders of Fatah will think in a new way. I'm not sure about it. But if Israel succeed in its attempt now to crush Hamas, maybe a new movement, Islamic politic movement, will rise, and maybe they will think in a new way that can make a unification between both. Or if Hamas will stay, maybe they will rethink again, and maybe they will change their document to something more moderate than it was in 2017. All of it is a result of the army pressure.
It doesn't necessarily have to be unification. It can be a partnership. It can be an association, whatever you want to call it. The three of you raised the influence of outside parties. And we all know that from the very origins of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, Arab states have had their hands in the agency of the Palestinians, either denying them the agency or trying to shape the agency, whenever that might be. Here today, we have Qatar, we have Iran, we have Turkey, and if one wants to go even further, we have UN institutions, all of whom have a measure of influence on what the Palestinians do on a day-to-day basis. And I would imagine that all four of those places and the people in them have an interest in maintaining some continued interest the day after this might unfold. They're not just all going to go away. Qatar is not going to go away and merely say, we don't want to play any role in Palestinian politics. What I'd like you to try and do for us is try and refine my very rough estimate on what the outside parties' influence are and what roles they could play positively. What can the Palestinians do in the West Bank or in Gaza if they are powerless?
What can the Palestinians do? I'm of the view that there's always something that you can do, no matter how adverse the situations are. And I look at, for example, domestic politics. Maybe we can do anything with Israel, especially with this government. But the corruption we see in the PA, the poor governance we see in the PA, that has nothing to do with any outside actor. Again, the Baathification, the ossification of Fatah politics has nothing to do with outside actors. So I think there's a lot on the domestic front that can be done. Yes, we have an Israeli government today that has no interest in anything good happening with the Palestinians. But as I said, there's something you can do for yourself. When it comes to the external actors, I have to say it's very different from the past in the following sense. The Arab world is changing. The Arab world, and if you look at what's happening in the Gulf right now, UAE, Saudi Arabia, we're almost in a post-ideological world. And this post-ideological world, where the focus is on the nation state, not on cross-boundary ideologies being pan-Arabism or Islamism or whatnot, means that for many of those countries, the Palestinian issue is no longer that important. And in many ways, actually, many of those Arab countries don't want to touch the Palestinian issue. They see it as a liability. Now, it's interesting that all the countries that you mentioned are actually countries supporting Hamas, because these are countries that continue, I think, to live and to advocate for this kind of ideological view of the region, be it the Qataris, be it the Turks, etc. So in many ways, what we will see in the day after Gaza should take that into account. I believe that if ultimately we allow the Hamas backers, again, the ones that you mentioned, Turkey and Qatar, Iran is not going to play an open role, obviously. Then what you're basically doing is we're setting up for the return of the strengthening of Hamas. If you look at the war in 2014, when Qatar and Turkey tried to mediate a ceasefire, they tried to mediate a ceasefire that's very favorable to Hamas. The question is, how do you convince the positive actors, be it the old peace partners, Jordan and Egypt, and more importantly, the Gulf countries, which have a new model of governance, to play a role? It's not an easy ask because, frankly, many of those are not comfortable doing any business with the Palestinian Authority as it stands, but also with the Israeli government as it stands. And many of those right now are not willing to engage in an American-led effort because they have their own gripes on the United States. But ultimately, the real challenge right now is how do you bring these kind of checked-out countries to play a role in Palestinian politics? Because at the moment, they simply are not interested, and the field is open to the more negative actors that you mentioned.
Hanan, say a couple words about the role that UNRWA plays in the day-to-day lives of the Palestinians. Here's an agency that has a real vested interest in the status quo.
If the Palestinian will be powerless, as you said before, I think that the main responsibility will reach to Israel at the end of the day. So if there will be no power in the Palestinian side that can take the responsibility, or he cannot take the responsibility, Israel as the state that need to keep the situation under control will be imposed to take some of this responsibility on its shoulder. And I think that it's one of the nightmares of Israel. They don't want to reach a situation that we will take again the responsibility for the people. I think even Netanyahu said before the war that the continuation of the Palestinian Authority is in Israeli interests. Even Gallant say, I think last week, that it's our interest to keep the Palestinian Authority as it is. It means that there will be a power that can take responsibility for what happened inside this issue.
I just want to emphasize for our viewers, there is a huge void, in my view, between what the Israeli government says and does. I know that the so-called day after is already been in work since the third or fourth day by several bodies, by the way. So the fact that the government is not willing to openly talk about it and to say what everybody knows already, I don't even think it's controversial. Okay, within the discussions in each body that deals with this question of the day after, you hear all sorts of views, but essentially everybody agrees that the day after, the Palestinians, whether under a revitalized Palestinian Authority, as Blinken called it, or another form, everybody agrees that the Palestinians will play a major role international community, and specifically, particularly Arab countries within the Abraham Accord. So really, I think we're only losing Israel, I mean, by the fact that the government is not addressing it and speaking about it openly. And to assure you that these things are actually being discussed for quite some time.
On the issue of the day after, and I don't want to underplay how important it is to change the Palestinian Authority. It is essential. And while I agree with Harel that it is understood that the Palestinians will do it, I have to emphasize that the Abraham Accord countries and the Arab countries in general, that to include Saudi Arabia, are not willing right now to do a blank check for anyone, not for the Palestinians and not for the Israelis. And when you hear the Saudis in particular saying we need certain preconditions, recognizing a two-state solution as an ultimate objective, accepting that ultimately the PA in some form or another is going to come. They are serious about it. I think, again, we have to internalize that they have their own interests. And unless Israel is willing to meet some of these interests, we might end up in a situation where Israel, even though they don't want it, might end up being stuck with Gaza because no one's going to come in and basically fix Israel's problem unless they get what they need to get.
Absolutely agreed.
I think that what we can say about this war is that this is the first time that the unified frontiers tried to bring themselves to the battlefield. And I think what happened here, it's a very important lesson that they learned from this first confrontation. I think that the way that the United States stand at the beginning of this confrontation show all the sides in this area, what does it mean unifying the frontiers against Israel? It's not a bilateral confrontation. It's something bigger than they thought it's going to be. So I think that the Americans play a very important role in this confrontation. And I think I can say that they show all the sides what's going to be if they are really trying to unify their power against Israel. Now, Israel can concentrate its efforts only in the south, in Gaza Strip. In the border in the north, there is only a small confrontation, and both sides knows very exactly that nobody wants to increase the conflict, and they keep the situation in a very limited level. So I think this is the lesson, the very, very important lesson that we have to learn from what they wanted to do in this case. If President Biden wouldn't say don't, maybe we would find ourselves in a very different place in this time.
In essence, it's not just the bilateral issue between Israel and Hamas, which is very important and critical for both of them. It's the bigger issue of the instability that's being perpetrated throughout the Middle East by those who are insurgents, those who are using petrodollars for a nefarious way. And the United States and even Western Europe, very unified, by the way, is essentially saying, this is not an area of the world that you should be playing in, you should be tinkering with, because we who are outside, we have interests here. We have not only our own interests, but we have the interest of protecting others who are friends of ours, like Jordan, like Egypt, like the Arabian Gulf countries. And when he says don't, he's not just meaning don't with Hamas. He's talking about the broader picture. The longer frame of this, if I can say this as a historian of U.S. foreign policy, this has always been part of American foreign policy with the Middle East. That is to contain insecurity and instability whenever possible, not to get engaged in a major way, but to try and keep the lid on and keep the pot from boiling. I would say what Biden has done, previous presidents have also done in terms of a much bigger, much broader perspective.
I think there is also another point that we have to mention here. The Arab countries those that had already signed an agreement with Israel, they didn't do anything during all this war in order to punish Israel or to express their disappointed from what Israel is doing. This is very important to understand. I don't remember who said it here, the way that they used to think about the Palestinian issue in this period.
The ideology is transnational. It doesn't do that anymore. It's not 25 years ago, essentially. It was a
Yes.
very important point that Gaith made. Look, gentlemen, we're all terribly indebted to you for your insights, for your encompassing kind of responses, for putting up with me. Thank you ever so much. We hope you'll join us again in the future. If you like what you saw today, if you like the Center for Israel Education, go to the website, help support our work.